Hollywood's spotlight has seen hundreds of stars burn bright, but only one Paul Newman could make the whole world pause the moment he walked into a room. Those ocean blue eyes, that half-sweet, half-mysterious smile, and an irresistible presence turned Newman into a cinematic legend, an enduring icon of masculine charm. From Cool Hand Luke to The Color of Money, he wasn't just an actor, he embodied style, talent, and charisma. To the public, Paul Newman seemed flawless, a gifted leading man, a devoted husband to Joanne Woodward, and an admirable father. Yet behind the dazzling glow were fractures few ever saw. Newman's life carried scandals of infidelity, a painful split from his first family, and later a battle with alcohol that nearly distanced him from his second. And then came the greatest heartbreak of all, the devastating loss of his son, Scott, to a drug overdose, a wound that never healed in the heart of a grieving father. The truth is, Newman was more than a Hollywood legend. He was flesh and blood, a man of flaws, weaknesses, and silent struggles hidden from the spotlight. That tension between the perfect image Hollywood projected and the complicated shadows of his reality made his life story more compelling than any film he ever starred in. To the world, Paul Newman was a shining beacon. But within, he often stumbled through the darkness of guilt, loss, and self-doubt. And yet, it was from those depths that he learned to rise, leaving behind not just unforgettable films, but also a legacy of compassion and humanity. The question lingers, how could a man so admired carry such painful secrets? And how did he transform that darkness into a source of strength, carving out a life of meaning? Newman was born in 1925 in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, a modest town that quietly set the stage for a stormy journey ahead. As a boy, he didn't stand out as the legend he would become. Newman was remembered as mischievous, sometimes unruly, and rarely exceptional at school. He wasn't a star athlete, and his grades were average at best. To many adults, Paul seemed like an ordinary, even unremarkable child. But it was in that very imperfection that his imagination found space to flourish, fueling a hunger for something beyond the ordinary. The turning point came when Paul was just 7. During a children's play at the Cleveland Playhouse, the blonde-haired boy with mischievous eyes stepped onto the stage for the first time. For him, it wasn't just child's play. The bright lights, the watchful audience, and the thrill of becoming someone else awakened a passion that would never leave him. From that moment, Newman had found his place to shine, not through math or sports, but through honesty of feeling. Newman's youth was a mix of defiance and curiosity. He caused headaches for teachers, but on the community stage, he became someone else, serious, focused, brimming with creative energy. That contrast may have been the making of Paul Newman, a man who could remain true to himself while fully inhabiting the complex lives of others. The Newmans weren't wealthy, but the household was warm enough to nurture his first steps. His father, Arthur, ran a sporting goods store, while his mother, Teresa, had a deep love for the arts. It was she who encouraged young Paul to take on small roles, at first just for fun. No one could have guessed that those simple community productions in Cleveland would mark the beginning of one of the most remarkable film careers of the 20th century. What made Newman extraordinary was that he never forgot where he came from. Even in the height of his Hollywood stardom, he often spoke of his Cleveland childhood as part of his identity, a place that taught him patience, resilience, and above all, the hunger to discover who he truly was. Those awkward, mischievous boyhood years laid the foundation for the man Paul Newman would become, not perfect, but real, and for that very reason, able to touch hearts across the world. In 1943, with World War II at its peak, 18-year-old Paul Newman left the small stage in Cleveland to put on the uniform of the United States Navy. Like so many young Americans of his generation, he yearned to serve his country. More than that, he dreamed of becoming a daring fighter pilot, the roar of planes across the sky stirring in him an intoxicating sense of freedom. But that dream was cut short by a harsh reality: Newman's math skills were too weak. The complex calculations required for aviation knocked him out of the program almost immediately. For many, it would have been a humiliating failure, a reminder of personal limits. For Newman, it became an early lesson in acceptance. Some paths simply weren't meant to be, and sometimes fate has other plans. Instead of piloting aircraft, Newman was assigned as a radio operator and gunner on an Avenger torpedo bomber. The role was both grueling and perilous. He was responsible for maintaining flawless communication during missions and manning the machine gun to defend the crew. On those endless flights across the Pacific, Newman learned the discipline of keeping sharp, minute by minute, knowing that even the smallest mistake could cost the entire crew their lives. War turned the mischievous boy into a man. He came face to face with fear, loss, and the sacred bond of brotherhood. Newman would later recall, in those quiet moments between missions, you stop thinking about yourself. You just pray the men beside you make it home. It was in those crucibles of silence and fire that empathy and compassion, the qualities that would define Paul Newman for decades to come, took root. And then fate intervened once more, this time to save his life. In 1945, Newman's unit was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill. But just before deployment, his commander grounded him after discovering a case of chronic ear infection, dangerous in flight. At the time, it seemed a bitter setback. In truth, it was the twist that spared his life. Days later, the Bunker Hill was struck by one of the most catastrophic kamikaze attacks of the war. Two Japanese planes dove into the carrier, triggering massive explosions that killed more than 390 sailors and airmen. Paul Newman's name was among those slated to be on board. But for the infection that kept him behind, he would almost certainly have perished with his crew. Surviving by sheer chance left Newman both grateful and burdened. He carried with him the haunting weight of those lost lives and the conviction that he had been granted a second chance. I wasn't a hero, he later admitted. I was just lucky enough to survive. And because of that, I had no right to live a meaningless life. War stole the youth of millions. But for Paul Newman, it also planted a hidden gift, a deep understanding of life's fragility, and a burning desire to make it matter. He returned not as a boy with vague ambitions, but as a man determined to find his true path, the one destiny had delayed, but never denied. After leaving the Navy, Paul Newman returned to civilian life with a heart heavy with the memories of war, yet burning with the desire to find his own path. He didn't go back to his family's sporting goods store in Shaker Heights. Instead, he chose to pursue the stage of flame that had been kindled when, at just 7 years old, he first stood under the lights of the Cleveland Playhouse. In 1949, Newman graduated from Kenyon College with a degree in drama. It was in that small Ohio campus where he first truly touched the language of theater, shaping his clumsy early attempts into a foundation of craft. But Newman knew the basics weren't enough. To go further, he needed more. He moved on to the Yale School of Drama, one of America's most renowned training grounds. There, Newman devoured every class, every script, every exhausting rehearsal. He wasn't the brightest star in the room at first, but the discipline and persistence forged in the military gave him the endurance to outlast. Many nights, he sat alone in an empty classroom, running a single line over and over, searching for the authentic rhythm in the words and in his own breath. His greatest turning point came at the Actors Studio in New York, under the legendary Lee Strasberg, master of method acting. Strasberg preached that to become a character, an actor must strip away all facades and dig into his own memories, his wounds. For Newman, that meant confronting a childhood of absence, the terror of war, and the sting of failure when his dream of being a pilot had collapsed. Those experiences, instead of burdens, became a reservoir of truth he could draw from on stage. At the Actors Studio, Newman learned the principle that would guide his career. The truth of the character must come from the truth within yourself. Then, in 1953, the breakthrough arrived. Newman landed a role in Picnic on Broadway. For the first time, New York audiences took notice. On stage, he radiated a rare magnetism, classic good looks, hypnotic blue eyes, and beneath them, a searing emotional intensity. He wasn't just handsome, he was real. Audiences felt the pain, yearning, and honesty pouring through every line he spoke. Backstage, another story began. During Picnic, Newman met Joanne Woodward, a talented young actress with bright eyes and a quick wit. At the time, Paul was still in his first marriage, but with Joanne, he discovered a profound connection. They shared the same devotion to their craft, the same hunger to live fully for the theater. If Newman was fire, Joanne was the cool, steady wind strong enough to keep that fire burning. Their meeting was more than fate's love story. It was a turning point in Newman's life. Joanne saw past the matinee idol exterior. She believed in the depth of a man who often tried to hide his uncertainties. That recognition became the foundation for a bond that would endure more than half a century, though the road toward it was anything but easy. Looking back, the path feels inevitable, from that childhood spark at Cleveland Playhouse, to Kenyon College, to Yale, to the Actors Studio, and finally to Broadway in 1953. Every challenge, every failure, every opportunity shaped a more mature, more complex Paul Newman ready for the blinding lights of Hollywood. But Broadway wasn't just the beginning of fame. It was also the stage where a complicated love story, filled with brilliance and shadows, began to unfold. Behind the laughter of young actors and the dust of the stage, Newman found himself drawn to Joanne Woodward. She wasn't conventionally glamorous, but she radiated intelligence, wit, and an energy Newman couldn't look away from. Unlike others, Joanne wasn't dazzled by his legendary blue eyes or masculine charm. She looked past the halo of fame and saw a man burning with ambition, yet shadowed by doubt. There was, however, one undeniable truth: Paul Newman was already a married man. In 1949, he had wed Jackie Whitty, a kind young woman who had shared his early, struggling years. Together, they had 3 children: Scott, Susan, and Stephanie. Jackie had stood by him when he was just a student, stumbling into theater, enduring poverty, sharing cramped apartments in New Haven and New York, living with uncertainty while he chased a dream. But love always finds its own way. With Joanne, Newman discovered a harmony he had never known before. She wasn't just a fellow actor, she was a soulmate, sparking in him a new sense of joy and belief. The two were drawn to each other during long nights of rehearsal, endless conversations about art, dreams, and life itself. Newman knew he was walking a dangerous road, but his heart could no longer turn back. The affair lasted 5 years, a period of torment, as Paul stood torn between his duties as a husband and father and his desire to live truthfully with his feelings. Jackie Witt, his devoted wife, slowly felt the widening distance between them. Newman's frequent absences, his long tours, and the heavy silences at home both signaled the storm to come. Jackie knew, with pain, that her husband's heart was elsewhere, but she had no way to hold on to him. In 1958, Paul Newman officially divorced Jackie Whitty. Nearly a decade of marriage ended, leaving Jackie deeply wounded and their children marked with the scars of a broken family. Scott, the eldest son, grew up carrying psychological wounds that later made him vulnerable to addiction and tragedy. Those shadows would haunt Newman for the rest of his life, even as he found happiness again. Not long afterward, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward married in January 1958. They chose a quiet ceremony in Las Vegas, away from the bright lights, as if to begin this new chapter without spectacle. For Joanne, it wasn't just marriage, it was sacrifice. Her career was soaring. She had just won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Three Faces of Eve 1957. Yet by choosing Newman, she accepted putting family above her own ambitions. In the early years, Newman and Woodward were celebrated as Hollywood's golden couple. They starred together in films like The Long Hot Summer and From the Terrace. On screen, their chemistry convinced audiences that love could conquer anything. Off-screen, they settled in Westport, Connecticut, seeking distance from the spotlight to build a home. Joanne gave Newman three daughters, Eleanor, Melissa, and Claire. But life was never just idyllic. As Newman's fame soared and he became one of Hollywood's brightest stars, Joanne gradually stepped into the background. Despite her Oscar and undeniable talent, her name was often eclipsed by his. In a male-dominated industry and society, Joanne sacrificed opportunities, becoming a full-time mother and caretaker of their household. Behind the image of a perfect family, quiet tensions lingered. Joanne loved Newman deeply, but there were moments she felt overshadowed, even abandoned in her own marriage. Newman's relentless schedule and the pressures of stardom meant he wasn't always present. Joanne would later admit she sometimes felt as though she was living in Paul's shadow, a shadow so vast it dimmed her own light. And yet, her patience and love kept their marriage from collapsing. She became the keeper of the flame, the one constant Newman could return to after the glamour, the pressures, and the mistakes. In later years, Newman often expressed his gratitude openly. He was famous for saying, "Why go out for hamburger when you have steak at home?" A quip that affirmed his devotion to Joanne, even after the painful lesson of his first affair. The marriage of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward endured for 50 years, weathering storms and triumphs alike. But its foundation had been laid on tragedy, the breaking of his first family, and the scars left on Jackie and their children. Newman carried that guilt for the rest of his life, a reminder that even a Hollywood legend could not escape the weight of his personal mistakes. It was that lingering guilt tempered by Joanne's deep love that shaped the Paul Newman the world came to know, not only a silver screen icon, but a man of contradictions, mistakes, and redemption. Someone who stumbled, yet learned to hold fast to what mattered most once he found it. After the uncertain early years on stage and the turbulence of his private life, Newman set his sights on a new challenge, the big screen. In 1954, he landed his first leading role in The Silver Chalice. It was supposed to herald the arrival of a brilliant young star, but instead, it became a humiliating failure. Critics mocked the clumsy script, stiff direction, and Newman's unpolished performance. The film was later branded one of the worst of the 1950s. Newman himself was so embarrassed that years afterward, whenever it aired on television, he would send out tongue-in-cheek public apologies to viewers. "It was a debut," he quipped. "I'd rather forget for the rest of my life." For many, such a flop might have buried a fledgling career. But for Newman, it became fuel. He was determined to prove that he was more than just a handsome face with striking blue eyes, that he could be a serious actor, capable of embodying complex characters. His redemption came just 2 years later with Somebody Up There Likes Me, 1956. Playing real-life boxer Rocky Graziano, Newman transformed himself raw, gritty, and deeply human. Gone was the awkward novice of The Silver Chalice. In his place stood a powerful actor earning rave reviews. The role didn't just salvage his career, it cemented Newman as a genuine Hollywood talent. That breakthrough set the stage for his true arrival. In 1958, Newman joined the ranks of Hollywood's A-list with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, adapted from Tennessee Williams's celebrated play. Starring opposite Elizabeth Taylor, he played Brick, a former football star drowning in drink, tormented and conflicted. The smoldering chemistry between Newman and Taylor created one of the most electric on-screen pairings of the decade. The performance earned Newman his first Academy Award nomination and established him as the embodiment of a new kind of leading man, alluring, vulnerable, and deeply complex. Throughout the 1960s, Newman's star only burned brighter, but perhaps his defining role of the decade came in Cool Hand Luke, 1967. As Luke, a rebellious prisoner unbowed by the harshest of systems, Newman captured the spirit of freedom, defiance, and human dignity. His piercing blue eyes, wry grin, and unyielding resistance made Luke an icon, one that still resonates today. The film brought Newman another Oscar nomination, but more importantly, it gave him a lasting place as the voice of a restless generation in a turbulent America. 2 years later, Newman reached new heights with Butch Cassidy in The Sundance Kid, 1969, starring alongside Robert Redford. The stylish Western became a cultural phenomenon, redefining the genre and drawing massive box office success. As the charming outlaw Butch Cassidy, Newman delivered a performance that was witty, magnetic, and deeply human. His on-screen camaraderie with Redford was legendary, sparking a lifelong friendship that transcended the screen. Their partnership triumphed again in The Sting, 1973, a sleek caper film that went on to win 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. While Newman himself did not take home a statue, his charismatic, razor-sharp performance, matched with Redford's, propelled him to even greater heights. By then, Newman was no longer just a movie star, he was a cultural icon, the ideal blend of rugged good looks, intelligence, and artistry. And yet, there was an irony. Through the 1960s and 1970s, despite multiple nominations, Newman repeatedly left the Oscars empty-handed. Critics began to call him Hollywood's perennial Oscar jinx. But Newman refused to let the snubs define him. He continued to seek out challenging roles, proving that, for him, the craft of acting mattered more than the accolades. Then, fate finally turned. In 1986, more than 3 decades into his career, Newman won the Academy Award for Best Actor with The Color of Money, reprising his role as pool hustler, Fast Eddie Felson from The Hustler 1961. This time, Eddie was no longer the brash young gambler, but a weathered man carrying years of regret, weariness, and hard-earned wisdom. Newman's performance was both powerful and delicate, mirroring his own journey from reckless young talent to mature, reflective artist. The moment Paul Newman stepped onto the stage to accept his Oscar, the entire Hollywood auditorium rose to its feet in applause. It was more than recognition for his role in The Color of Money. It was a tribute to a lifetime of perseverance, of failures overcome, of a journey that stretched from the humiliation of the Silver Chalice to his place as one of the greatest actors in cinema history. Paul Newman's career proved that true success doesn't come from fleeting luck, but from persistence, from the ability to learn, to stumble, and to rise again. From being ridiculed, he fought his way into the hearts of audiences, won the respect of critics, and eventually triumphed over the toughest artistic standards. And behind those legendary blue eyes was a relentless drive, a man who refused to let failure define him, and instead used it as a springboard to reach new heights. But away from the spotlight of his legendary performances, Newman carried a private darkness, his battle with alcohol. Few people knew just how deep it ran. For years, he drank heavily, admitting later that there was a time when he consumed nearly a case of beer a day, often followed by hard liquor. For most, alcohol might have been a passing indulgence. For Newman, it became a prison, an escape that slowly turned into a trap. The more successful he became, the more he leaned on the bottle, seeking to numb the pressures of fame and the shadows of his past. The one who suffered most was not Newman himself, but Joanne Woodward, the woman who had given up her own stardom to stand behind her husband, raising their children and anchoring their home. Joanne had hoped their marriage would be her safe harbor, but alcohol often turned Newman into someone she barely recognized, irritable, exhausted, and at times out of control at parties or even during family evenings. What broke her most was not just his drinking, but the helplessness of watching the man she loved destroy himself. The breaking point came one fateful night, when Newman, drunk, fell and was badly injured. The accident left a physical scar, but the deeper wound was in Joanne's heart. She realized with horror that if things continued, she might lose her husband, not to an accident, but to a slow self-destruction. Newman would later admit, "I could have lost everything, just because of a bottle." In the aftermath, their marriage reached a crisis. Joanne, worn down by years of struggle, thought seriously about walking away. She drew a hard line: either Newman faced his addiction or their marriage was over. For Newman, the lowest moment came during one bitter fight when he ended up sleeping in his car for days. From being a star adored around the world, he suddenly felt like a man exiled in his own home. Alone at night, sitting in the driver's seat with a bottle at his side, he felt the emptiness closing in. And in that silence, he finally saw the truth. Alcohol was not a companion, but an enemy, stealing everything he held dear. That realization became a turning point. Newman began the long, painful journey of confronting his addiction with Joanne at his side. Forgiveness did not come instantly, but his persistence slowly reached her. He cut back, replaced drinking with healthier habits, and most importantly, devoted more time to his family. Where he once sought escape in alcohol, he now faced life head-on with love, with responsibility, and with a desire to be the husband and father his family deserved. What made the difference was not just his own determination, but Joanne herself. She was not simply a forgiving wife, she was the anchor that steadied him in the storm. She reminded him that real love is not measured in passion alone, but in the willingness to stand by each other through the darkest seasons. Through her strength, Newman found his balance again, learning to turn his weakness into a source of resilience. Looking back years later, Newman admitted, if it hadn't been for Joanne or Newman, I would have been completely lost. That confession was more than gratitude. It was a recognition that even the greatest icons need something or someone to hold on to. Their marriage bore its scars, but it was those very trials that made their love endure. The story of Newman's struggle with alcoholism not only reveals a hidden, darker side of his life, but also delivers a powerful message. Success offers no immunity against temptation, and happiness cannot last without patience and forgiveness. The reconciliation after his battle with the alcohol didn't just save a marriage, it allowed Paul Newman to carry on with his career and life with a clearer, more complete heart. In 1969, when Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid premiered and became a box office sensation, Newman was hailed as one of the greatest actors of his generation. But at the very height of his fame, a rumor spread like wildfire, threatening to burn down the carefully crafted image of the family man he had built with Joanne Woodward. The rumor was of an 18-month affair with journalist Nancy Bacon. According to some accounts, the relationship began while Newman was filming Butch Cassidy. The pressures of the set, a relentless schedule, and time apart from his family supposedly left him vulnerable to finding solace in Nancy. Though no hard evidence ever emerged, the press seized on the story, blowing it up into a scandal that captured headlines. Suddenly, Paul Newman, the loyal husband who once quipped, "Why go out for hamburger when I have steak at home?" saw his reputation shaken. For Joanne Woodward, the whispers cut especially deep. She had once been the other woman herself during Newman's marriage to Jackie Witt, and knew all too well how damaging gossip could be. The public was always ready to doubt, especially when it came to a handsome, charismatic star who spent much of his life away from home. Instead of staying silent, Newman and Joanne confronted the scandal head-on. They even paid for an ad in the Los Angeles Times to publicly deny the allegations. It was more than damage control. It was a declaration that they would not let rumor dictate their marriage. Still, the public remained skeptical. For many, and where there's smoke, there's fire. And even without proof, the whispers left scars on the golden couple's image. Newman was devastated to realize how a single unverified story could erode the trust he and Joanne had built over years. Though he insisted on his fidelity, Joanne was the one left to endure judgmental stares and public scrutiny. She wasn't just protecting her marriage, she was protecting her dignity. The Nancy Bacon scandal eventually faded, but its shadow lingered. It reminded Newman that love and marriage are tested not only by real temptations, but also by the invisible power of rumor. For Joanne, it was another moment of choice to believe her husband, or the noise around them. She chose belief because without trust, they never would have survived the storms that came before. The story reflects a harsh truth about celebrity life. The more adored you are, the more you live under a magnifying glass. And through that glass, every mistake or even a whisper of one gets blown out of proportion. Not even Paul Newman, the legend, was immune. The scandal didn't erase Newman's career, but it served as a bitter reminder that fame is a double-edged sword. More importantly, it proved the resilience of his bond with Woodward. Tested, doubted, and picked apart, they still held on, showing that their marriage was built on something stronger than gossip. Then in 1978, a nightmare struck that no parent should ever face. Scott Newman, Paul's son with Jackie White, died at just 28 of a drug overdose. Scott had long wrestled with living in his father's shadow, eager to prove himself, but crushed under the weight of comparison. Struggling to find his place in Hollywood, he spiraled into addiction. That tragic night, when the news broke, Paul collapsed. The man who had stood firm against Hollywood's toughest battles was brought to his knees by the loss of his child. The grief was compounded by guilt. Newman constantly asked himself, could he have done more to save Scott? Had his relentless pursuit of career and stardom blinded him to his son's cries for help deep down? Newman carried the tormenting belief that a father's love hadn't been enough to fill the void his fame created. But instead of letting the tragedy consume him, Newman transformed his pain into action. He founded the Scott Newman Center, a nonprofit devoted to educating young people about the dangers of drugs and substance abuse. For him, it wasn't just charity, it was atonement, a way of keeping Scott's memory alive, and a vow that other families might be spared the same devastation. The Scott Newman Center became a legacy born of sorrow, but also of resilience. Paul knew he couldn't bring his son back, but he could stop others from walking the same destructive path. Behind those legendary blue eyes lay a scar that never healed, and it was that scar that pushed him to live with greater purpose. Proof that even in the deepest darkness, hope can be found. When Paul Newman passed away in 2008 after a battle with lung cancer, the world mourned. He left behind an unfillable void, but also an enduring legacy, a legendary actor with timeless performances, a passionate race car driver who shook Daytona at 70, and a humanitarian who turned personal tragedy into a lifeline for others. Newman wasn't perfect. He carried his flaws, his passions, and his heartbreaks, but that's what made his story so profoundly human. He proved that even the fallen can live fully, love deeply, and leave behind an immortal mark. And you, when you look back at Paul Newman's life, what do you see as the reason he became a timeless icon?